October 26, 1993, 3:41 p.m. Evan Hale steps off Meramec Caverns Road and into a slit of limestone the width of his shoulders, 20 minutes west of Stanton, Missouri, just beyond I-44's mile marker 230. The air is colder here, older, like the hill itself is drawing a breath. At 6:07 p.m., a ranger's voice will crackle across a radio. Dispatch, Unit 12. 10 to 20 Meramec Caverns Road, MP 1.8. Possible unauthorized entry via side fissure. Copy. Between those two times something will slip its hand over this valley and hold. What happened to Evan Hale? 3 years from tonight, a retired ranger will say one thing that changes everything. The cave had already chosen who would not return. Evan is 19 and thinks in layers. Shale stacked over limestone, secrets pressed under daylight. He takes classes at the community college when money and hours allow, sleeps light in his grandmother's small house off Route 66, and spends his off days tracing blue pencil lines across photocopied karst maps. Cole Whitaker, 20, runs hot. He fixes mufflers in a metal garage that smells like oil and rain and talks his way around rules without ever quite appearing to break them. Daniel Reyes, 19, is the one who writes things down. He's the man with the notebook, block letters marching across grid paper, tiny arrows, odd measurements, the slope of a floor, the echo that felt too soft for the space you were in. They are not boys. They have jobs and bills and the tiredness that sets into your shoulders by the end of a long week. But there's a part of the three of them that refuse to age on schedule, the part that reaches for a flashlight when the world says turn one off. They meet that morning in the corner of the county library where the microfiche hums and the old magazines go to sleep. Cole nudges a dog-eared article toward the others. A side system at Meramec, a closed for safety note from the mid-50s, a diagram as careless as a rumor. It's there, he says, tapping a line that isn't quite a line. Evan marks a dot with his pencil. Daniel writes the date, time, temperature, and wind direction because that is what he does when he is scared and doesn't want to be. They do not tell anyone. Cole says he picked up a late shift that he will skip. Daniel tells his father he is helping a friend move a sofa. Evan leaves a note on the kitchen table for his grandmother that says, "Study group, home by 9." And places it under the sugar jar because she always looks there first. Before they roll out, Evan takes a roll of orange survey tape from the glove compartment and snaps a length between his hands. The sound is small and decisive. The plan is simple enough to feel safe and complicated enough to feel real. Ride to the service turnout, cut through scrub, drop into a narrow sinkhole locals call the wishing well, and find where the air breathes. They lock the bikes to a cedar at the end of a gravel pull-off where the road loses its paint. The interstate hums down in the river bend, a line of modern certainty stitched across the hills, but up here the trees stand still and listen. Evan tests his headlamp and tucks batteries in a zip bag. Cole tightens a worn-in climbing belt around his hips and grins in a way that dares you to tell him no. Daniel thumbs the pages of his notebook, the one he keeps in a sandwich bag when the world gets wet. They drop into shadow one by one, boots skating, palms brushing damp rock. Civilization stays above, thin as a radio band. Inside is not silent. Water speaks in single notes. The walls shine like black glass where fingers have never learned the habit of touching. A cold draft moves against their faces as if the hill has lungs. Evan ties the first strip of orange to a nub of stone, then the next at roughly 50 feet. Then a third when the daylight disappears behind a bend and the beam of his lamp becomes the only clock. He calls the markers breadcrumbs because it steadies Daniel, and because it steadies himself. Cole walks ahead with his shoulders tilted to clear a seam where the ceiling dips. Daniel murmurs measurements, then stops, listening. The sound comes again, soft and wrong, a footstep that drags and lifts, not like a ranger's boot, not like any animal they know. They reach a junction where the floor leans, a three-way mouth cut by time and groundwater. The right passage runs lower, the roof pressing so close you feel your name thinning to fit it. The center rises, promising space you can stand inside. The left looks clean and honest and is therefore suspect. Cole studies the smudge diagram like it holds a promise he can enforce. Evan holds the tape and feels it tremble with his pulse. Daniel draws the junction with a dull pencil, lays in arrows, writes 3:58 p.m., then draws a little box in the corner and fills it in. "We keep this simple," Cole says, and smiles as if courage were a thing you could split 3 ways and carry. They go right. The air tightens and the distance in front of them shrinks to a yard, then a foot, then the width of 2 hands. Evan breathes through his mouth when the ceiling slicks his hair. Daniel's knee knocks a pebble into a black drop and the echo comes back late, as if time itself had to lean around a corner to answer. A set of scratches appears on the wall at shoulder height. They are too deep for a pocket knife and too old for any joke. Mineral has grown into the wounds, calcite suturing a message the cave doesn't intend to translate. Evan raises his lamp and the letters dissolve into shape that isn't letters. Daniel writes, "Marks, unknown," and draws them anyway. The dragging footfall returns from somewhere that feels adjacent and impossible. Cole's light finds only rock and the small, damp breath of a corridor that narrows into decision. None of them say this is far enough. None of them say turn back. Evan ties another flag, the orange bright against the dark like a sentence you can't unsay, and they step forward toward a noise that waits for a name. Cole takes the right-hand passage because he believes momentum is a kind of luck you earn. The roof slides down until their backs bend, the floor leans toward a black lip where sound goes to be counted. Evan moves second with the roll of orange tape hooked to his belt, Daniel last with the notebook pressed to his chest as if it could keep a rib from breaking. The rock narrows into a slot that asks for a shoulder turn just so. Air pushes through with the steady pull of something larger breathing. Then Evan hears it again, breath that isn't theirs, close enough to feel on the bare skin at the base of his neck. He stops without meaning to, lamp washing a seam of mineral that throws the light back wrong. Cole half turns, mouth open to say keep coming, and the cave answers first with a dry, deep grind like teeth. The ceiling moves. It does not fall so much as decide. Stone drops into the slot and stops exactly where Evan is. The blow isn't a strike, it's a clamp. His jaw catches the floor, the ridge of the boulder pins neck and shoulder, weight pouring through him until vision pulses white at the edges. His body goes small around the pain. He can breathe, but only in the shallow sips a frightened swimmer takes. Dust lifts, hangs, and tastes like old pennies. Cole's lamp snaps toward him, then the light is cut by stone. "Evan!" Cole's voice hits the rock and scatters. Daniel shoves forward from the other side and the slot denies him. He can see Evan's boots and nothing else. Evan tries to say I'm okay, discovers he isn't sure how to make sound fit through pain, and exhales a wordless yes that makes both men go still. For a long moment, 6 heartbeats he will count later, no one moves. Then everything moves. Cole jams his hands into gaps the size of knuckles, his fingers come back with chalky grit, he goes again. Daniel strips off his pack and works the strap under the edge of the rock, trying to make a sling against physics. They talk because talking keeps air in the room. Daniel says, "In on the 3. 1, 2, and they pull with a noise people make when they forget they have neighbors. The stone complains an inch and then pretends it never did. Evan tries to use his legs. The cave tells him no. He can feel his pulse against the floor. He can feel the thought of his grandmother noticing the note under the sugar jar at 9 and washing a cup with hands that don't shake until they do. They try the rope in 3 places, then a bent length of aluminum tent pole as a lever that fails at exactly the wrong angle. Cole's jaw sets the way it does when a rusted bolt will not admit the wrench exists. He leans so hard his boots skid. Daniel narrates what he is doing to hold back panic, speaking in the same tone he uses to label diagrams, adding the time out loud so the world won't blur. For 27, for 31, for 39. Evan, still and small underweight, learns the shape of the boulder the way a tongue learns a chipped tooth. In the half inches he owns, he finds the bottle Cole slides toward his hand and takes 2 careful swallows. The water turns into something like light in his chest. When the silence between their attempts becomes longer than the effort, the 3 of them understand without saying it. Cole rests his forehead against rock for a beat, and when he lifts it he is already the version of himself that leaves and comes back. He talks through the route as if it had become a contract. Back through the squeeze, bare left at the 3-mouth, orange markers every 50 feet. Avoid the sloped floor with the black lip, follow the draft to daylight. "You have the spare," he says, tapping the extra headlamp he's already unclipped and set where Evan can reach. Daniel lays a rectangle of chocolate in the small triangle of space by Evan's fingers and then pushes his notebook into his own pack like a person filing a will. "We'll bring a jack," Cole says, and it is not a promise because promises are cheap. It is a plan spoken so cleanly it becomes a thread. Evan does not want them to go. Wanting is a child's verb and he is not a child, but he uses it anyway. Cole hears it, leans close to the line where the rock took Evan from him, and puts his palm there, flat on the stone. "Count your breaths," he says, and his voice is steady but his eyes are not. Daniel adds, "Sing if you get scared. It helps with rhythm." He says it like a man declaring the truth of tide charts. Their light drifts away down the corridor in pieces as if swallowed, and Evan watches it until the last shard collapses into dark. Civilization leaves with them, thin as a radio band. He listens. The cave becomes a list of sounds. Drip, draft, his own heart, a faint ticking somewhere like a cooling engine. He takes a breath, another, a third, and reaches the point in the fourth where the room thins and comes back. He calls out once, "If you're a ranger, I'm stuck," and the sentence dies in a room he can't see. It shouldn't carry at all, not with the stone biting down, but sound finds a way through seams the light cannot. He calls again, softer, because you learn quickly that the dark listens back. Something shifts beyond the choke point, not the scrape of Cole's boot, not Daniel's quiet clatter. It is a single, careful footstep that does not belong to the two men he loves like brothers, placed with the patience of someone who already knows this path by heart. Then the air turns slightly colder against his face, and he realizes he is no longer alone. Cole and Daniel hit the surface at 7:12 p.m., lungs burning, shins mud-caked, the daylight gone so completely it feels invented. They sprint the last 50 yards to the park office, bang on glass until a night ranger in a coffee-stained shirt appears and gives them that look older men give when youth and trouble arrive together. Cole doesn't waste breath on charm. He lays the facts down in short, hard lines, and Daniel slides his notebook open to the map he drew in heat and adrenaline. The ranger's skepticism lasts until he sees orange survey tape clinging to Daniel's sleeve and the steady shake in Cole's hands. He keys the radio and speaks with a clipped calm that changes the temperature of the room. Units spin up. Headlamps, jacks, medpacks, names called out like tools. The boys follow him back into a night with edges. By 8 the first team is at the wishing well sinkhole with ropes uncoiled like veins. Cole insists on leading, but protocol is gravity in a badge. He and Daniel walk second line behind two cavers who move like water running downhill. They step past the cedar where the bikes still sit locked and wet, and the tree seems to mark a border. Above it, you have bars on your phone, context, weather reports. Below it, breath and light are the only currencies that spend. Retracing the route is like waking from a vivid dream and finding the door hung in a different wall. The tapes that should be there are there, until they aren't. A strip of orange Evan tied to a nub now flutters on a rock none of them remember, as if someone moved the knot and the stone grew around it. Cole swears they went left at the three-mouth and right at the seam. The caver in front says the seam has shifted, which rock does when your memory leans. Daniel hears his own voice take on a professor's tone to keep panic in a cage. Mark the turn, count the paces, note the draft, note the incline. The cave answers with its own curriculum. Batteries dim in perfect lamps. Two radios catch a whispering static that forms almost words and then breaks into grain. Somewhere ahead, a single tap repeats in a measure that feels human. When the team moves toward it, the sound takes 2 steps back and dissolves. At 10:43 p.m., they reach the tight slot where the floor leans toward that black lip. The first rescuer wedges in until the rock curls his shoulders forward and says he can see a slab that shouldn't be there, fresh dust in the creases, a narrow triangle of space underneath. He calls Evan's name and hears the name come back wrong, bent around stone. They feed a thermal probe into the gap. The machine returns with a rumor of warmth, not a silhouette. Good enough. The team leader says, "Airway first," and they thread an oxygen hose along the floor, praying it finds a mouth. It hisses into shadow and keeps hissing, the least comforting lullaby in the world. Cole wants to break policy into parts and carry Evan out on his back. Policies are designed for the living. They hold. The hours stretch thin. They try a jack, a lever, then a different jack. The ceiling groans in a language the cave has spoken for longer than there were rangers. Twice they pull back, twice they go again. Daniel's pencil dulls to a soft stump. He tears a page into strips and numbers them when his hands tremble too much to write in lines. Each number is a marker against chaos. He whispers the time, 11:18, 12:03, 1:26, to the dark as if the cave might respect a schedule. On the surface, Nora Hale's porch light burns a small sun into the night. She reads the note under the sugar jar, folds it smaller, and drives herself to the gravel turnout because moving is easier than waiting. Someone puts a blanket over her shoulders the way people do when they don't have better ideas. She watches headlamps flick and vanish at the sinkhole's mouth and begins counting them like beads because counting is how you keep hope from fraying. Before dawn, fresh teams arrive from 2 counties over. A paramedic with a soft voice talks them through improbable scenarios and prepares for the one everyone is afraid to name. The map table swells with copies and coffee rinks. A scout comes up with news that doesn't fit any legend they have for this place. The passage beyond the choke point has changed. In a section they had marked passable 2 hours ago, the ceiling has sighed down and kissed the floor. A secondary collapse, someone says not loudly. The phrase sits on the table and makes the paper curl. They push again that morning and again that night and then the next, and the cave answers on its timeline. A right develops, safety checks, comms checks, a whispered cuss, a careful entry. Small victories come, a hose advanced, a new crack found, a groan that might be promise, and then vanish. News crews arrive with lenses and polite questions that cut anyway. Cole gives them nothing. Daniel writes everything down. Nora brings coffee, then sandwiches, then silence. On the 4th day, a rescuer hears faint tapping like knuckles on a door, follows it through 3 turns and a crawl, and loses it as if the house itself walked away. When he doubles back, there's a strip of orange tape tied to a spur he swears was bare, cinched with the neat, tight knot Evan favors. He unties it with shaking fingers and does not say what he is thinking out loud. By the end of the week, the official line is that survival after 72 hours in those temperatures is unlikely, and the unofficial one is that no one tells Nora to go home. The cave keeps its mouth closed. On a night when the wind combs the trees into one sound and the radios go quiet in the way that scares professionals, a rescuer stands in the dark thinking about all the things rock can hide and wonders, not for the first time, who else knows these corridors well enough to move where men with maps cannot. Dawn comes thin and colorless, the kind that makes headlights look like candles. A volunteer team edges into the cold mouth of the wishing well and stops as one man lifts a hand. From somewhere ahead, past a bend they've mapped and remapped, a thread of sound unwinds through stone. It is not a shout or a moan. It's a melody, a tune people hum when words won't climb, a few notes of something old sung under a breath that has learned to be careful. Hold, the team leader says as if he's afraid to scare the sound away. They move toward it in small pieces, pausing to listen, choosing the right fork when the pitch sharpens and the wrong one when it dulls. The song keeps its distance and then, suddenly, doesn't. The slot passage is still there, mean and narrow, the floor still leaning toward the black where echoes count themselves. Fresh dust coats the shoulders of the slab that chose Evan. In the triangle of space beneath it, a face turns toward the light and flinches. Eyes adjust. A hand rises, slow, palm open like a truce. "I'm here," Evan says, and his voice is hoarse with the grit of weeks. He is thinner, yes, the bones in his cheeks sharper than anyone remembers, but his lips are not cracked, and the pupils that find the rescuers do not have the washed-out look of a body at the end of its tries. Someone threads the oxygen hose to his mouth. He takes it, nods once, and keeps looking past them as if expecting another figure to step into the circle of light and claim him. The rescue grows out of rehearsed muscle memory. Wedges placed where they won't invite a second collapse. A low-tone pump. A jack ratcheting in breaths, quarter-inch by quarter-inch. A medic talks to him through the noise, the practiced murmur people learn when pain lives in the room. "Name." Evan answers. "Where are we?" He says, "Meramec." "How long?" He says after a pause measured in tight breaths, 3 days. The medic's eyes meet the team leaders and slide away. No one corrects him. The plan demands all the air they have. Arguments can starve later. It takes 4 hours to persuade the stone to show mercy. When the weight lifts enough, Evan does not spring free. He is cautious in a way you only learn when the world has sat on your chest. Hands guide his shoulder, then his hip. He inches clear and the slab settles back into its cradle with a tired sigh. They splint what needs splinting, wrap what needs warmth, fit a soft collar around his neck. He drinks in careful sips. Someone presses a glucose gel against his tongue and he closes his eyes like a man tasting summer after a long winter. Cole isn't allowed down the last stretch, not with the ceiling compromised, so when they bring Evan into the bigger chamber with room for people to stand up and remember being tall, Cole steps forward and breaks at the knees into a hug that ends quickly because the medic raises a hand. Daniel stands there holding his notebook as if facts could apologize. Evan studies their faces like maps he's afraid someone redrew. "You came back," he says, as if the fact still needs to be named. Cole says, "Told you I would." Daniel says nothing and starts to write because this is how he makes things stay. On the surface, the air has that metallic edge hills take on at the start of winter. Nora Hale holds a paper cup she doesn't drink from and watches the mouth of the sinkhole the way believers watch a door. When the first helmet breaches daylight and then another and then a third, she doesn't move, afraid if she does the picture will tilt and spill. Then she sees her grandson's hair in the window of the litter, the particular bend of his mouth you can't fake, and something at the base of her throat lets go. Relief is a hard thing. It comes in tears and shaking and the sudden need to sit down before the ground decides it will help you. Later, under a tent that flaps like a flag in the cold wind, the questions begin, gentle as prods can be. Evan answers what he can and stops where his mind tells him the edges are. He says he heard footsteps that didn't belong to Cole or Daniel, deliberate and patient, never rushed. He says water was poured for him, not dripped, and that food arrived in small amounts. Bread, a bite of cheese, a piece of something dried that turned to sweetness when he held it to his tongue. He says he called out and that whoever helped him did not speak. When they ask if he saw a face he says, "No, just the shape of someone being careful." When they ask how often he says, "Often enough." Teams go back in with cameras and bags and the energy of people who want to replace mystery with inventory. They find no wrappers, no camp, no prints. Near the slab, on a small shelf of rock where light pools and then slips away, a brass disc sits half swallowed by mineral. It is stamped with numbers and letters that look like a year people wore on their shoulders. A tech slides it into an evidence envelope and writes too carefully. In a trailer, a geophysicist runs ground-penetrating radar over a rough grid and shakes his head. The pocket where Evan lay is isolated by tons of collapsed roof. The route Cole and Daniel used is a sealed line on the monitor. The map says no. Evan's story says someone found a yes anyway. When they ask him how long he was under, he says again, 3 days, and looks hurt when they gently tell him the date. He goes quiet, then asks if the song he sang was loud enough, and Nora puts a hand on his shoulder and says, "It was, baby. It was just right." The medic checks vitals that refuse to look like a month. Outside, wind drives a thin rain across the parking lot and the press lights smear in it. The cave mouth sits where it has always sat, saying nothing. Someone in a uniform tapes new warning signs to a sawhorse and writes the word closed in a line so black it looks carved. The first plate at Nora's table went missing that night. 3 years pass the way limestone forms, slow to the eye, certain underneath. By the fall of 1996, the story has stopped being a headline and become a rumor the town can't quite spit out. Cole Whitaker wears a uniform now and writes sparingly from bases with names Nora has to look up on a paper map. Daniel Reyes is in a state lab most days, tracing the path of water through bluffs and fields, drawing clean models that behave better than the real thing. Evan Hale goes back to class when he can keep the hours and, on weekends, walks the ridges over the river with a small notebook of his own. He doesn't go underground. He doesn't swear off it either. Life collects around the scar on his shoulder like sediment around a stone, and some mornings the kitchen smells like coffee and normal, until the second plate on the table is empty and no one remembers taking it. On the week of the anniversary, a thin white envelope arrives with the federal seal in the corner and a rubber stamp fatigue that suggests the machine has done what it can. Daniel filed the FOIA months ago with the dry patience of a man who knows the earth keeps its ledgers. He brings the envelope to Nora's and spreads the copies under the kitchen light. There are pages, lot of them, and there are boxes of ink where sentences once lived. A line survives. Secondary collapse observed in Sector D, route sealed. Another, no viable ingress identified to pocket. A third, object retrieved, pending analysis, followed by a black rectangle the size of a thumb. Daniel touches the edge and doesn't quite smile. The brass disc sits in Nora's sugar bowl because there is no safer place anyone trusts. It looks older in a house than it did in a tent, as if daylight made it shy. Evan turns it in his fingers the way you spin a coin to hear what kind of metal sings. Numbers rise from the face, softened by time, and a letter that could be an E or a 3. Daniel knows a metallurgist at the university who owns an old Rockwell tester and a better instinct than the budget he works under. They bring the disc in a napkin and a borrowed courage. The tester's needle marks the hardness as if taking a pulse. Composition looks like mid-19th century brass. The man says, a little too carefully. He prints the report on paper that curls at the edges and tells them he has no opinion on how the object found them. The same week, a voice from the older side of town asks to meet. They find Charles Whitlow at a diner that never changed its coffee filters when the world changed its cars. He has the posture of a man who counted his days in seasons, not shifts. 35 years in Meramec, he says, and then presses 2 fingers to the table in a habit that sounds like an oath. He talks in the plain sentences of people who learned to be believed without raising volume. There are places you don't see on the brochure. They weren't missed, they were withheld. Some are fragile, some are ugly with history, some are what happens after you blow a door shut and pretend it was never there. He tells them about carvings found in the 50s, dates and names that mineral adopted, about an old lantern left where no tourist would ever stand, about a sheet of limestone with a shallow panel of scratch marks that read like rules. Water here, shelter there, help the lost, don't be seen. He says the page that described the panel went missing, and the man who wrote it transferred to a park with flat ground. Evan listens like he's standing at an edge he swore off and just found again. The melody he sang in the narrow place returns to his throat uninvited, 1 bar only, like a fingerprint. Whitlow watches him and says, not unkindly, that some things in a cave want to be left dark so they can keep doing what they do. He sets a folded map on the table, old paper under new coffee stains. The lines look wrong at first because they are honest. He taps a finger on a blank space between 2 published chambers and says that men with hammers sealed a bad opening there in '65 to keep kids out and water in. You don't unlearn a place just because you shut a door on it, he says. Someone teaches someone else, or they follow a mark in a wall that you and I walk past. Later that night, Evan stands in Nora's narrow kitchen and watches rain blur the porch light into a smear. The disc lies beside the sugar bowl, mute and heavy. The redacted pages are tidy in a manila folder. Cole's latest letter is tucked under a magnet shaped like Missouri, a lean loop of ink that says he's fine and doesn't say anything about the part of him that still kneels in a chamber waiting for a jack to lift. Daniel has drawn 3 routes on tracing paper and laid them over Whitlow's fold-out like transparencies from school. 2 end in stone. 1 ends in white space that isn't a space at all, just the stubborn absence where a map refuses to admit a future. Evan sets out 3 plates. He pauses, thinking, and adds a 4th. He doesn't say why, only that the house sleeps better when the count is right, and somewhere out in the black knot of the hills, something that knows the old rules pauses and listens back. The next morning, someone slides an unlabeled envelope through Nora's mail slot with a photocopy of a limestone panel and a single penciled note, "You were not alone." The copy of the limestone panel sits under a magnet on Nora's fridge, black and white scratches that look like a field of winter stalks. Evan studies it between chores and classes the way a man checks the weather. Not because he expects it to change, but because weather decides other things. The penciled note, "You were not alone," has left a shape in the day he can't sand flat. He keeps setting 4 plates at supper. Nora never asks why. The house feels less empty when he does, and if once a week the fourth plate goes missing from the drying rack and returns clean to the cabinet by morning, they both choose to be bad at counting. Daniel calls on a gray Saturday with the thin excitement of a man whose models have finally blinked. He's been mapping a perched aquifer over the bluff and finds a seep that shouldn't exist, a thread of clean water appearing in a sandstone seam that argued against it for decades. The sample reads like a signature, low in certain minerals, high in others, a profile that matches the water lab pulled from Evan's canteen in '93. He says it like an apology for the world being stranger than lab reports allow. Evan pulls on boots. They hike the ridge where cedars cut the sky into teeth and stop when the wind changes temperature the way air does near an open door. Daniel marks coordinates, adds them to Whitlow's folds, and the lines begin to look less like superstition and more like an unwanted truth. Someone knows how to move through this place the way we move through streets. An independent caver from 2 counties over sends Daniel a photo that doesn't make sense. It's a cache in a shallow alcove, 2 glass jars with their labels boiled off, a neat stack of cloth squares that look like cut shirt sleeves, a slate of rock scorched in the center as if used to warm something without flame. No footprints in the silt, the caption says. No oil. The caver promises to lead a second trip and then writes back a week later to say a joyless sign appeared overnight. A sawhorse and a closed placard at the turnout that had always been empty. You could call it coincidence. You could call it someone protecting a thing that has protected others longer than we've been taking pictures of it. Cole comes home on leave in a jacket that carries desert dust in its seams and stands at the sink with his fingertips on the sugar bowl as if the brass disc inside it could teach him how to stand in rooms again. He doesn't say much about the places he's been. The parts he does tell all have the same echo. You go where the map tells you until the map stops speaking. He picks up the disc, turns it once, and sets it down like a promise you don't break by saying out loud. That night, he and Evan sit on the porch with a thermos between them, and the hill breathes in the way the panel described, old air moving through old passages, keeping its own counsel. We don't have to go back down, Cole says. No, Evan answers. We don't. The relief in the word is not small. Not everything that follows is a sign, but enough of it is. Twice Nora wakes to find the back door unlatched and the night cold shouldered into the hallway. Once Evan finds a heel of bread on the sill, dry and clean and set so square it looks measured. The cat that adopts them 1 week pads to the doorway at 2 in the morning and stares with its tail tall as a flag, then relaxes at a sound no one else hears. Daniel, who has never been given to faith in anything but data, starts leaving a bottle of water in the trunk of his car, for field work, and carries 2 extra in his pack whenever he walks within a mile of the sinkhole. On a trail above the river, he ties a strip of orange tape to a reed-thin branch and looks back later to see the knot retied in a better way. The park grows more careful in the next months. Fences go up at quiet junctions. Signs turn plain and absolute. A ranger with a careful voice tells Daniel off the record that closing is sometimes saving, and that if he knew what it cost to find that out he would not demand the invoice. The map that once fit in a brochure refolds into a different shape. There are white spaces again, and they mean what white spaces used to mean before we decided we could own everything we step on. Evan keeps walking the ridge, keeps setting the 4th plate, keeps living with the knowledge that someone who owes him nothing chose him anyway. He doesn't go back into the cave. He doesn't hide from it either. On the 3rd winter after the envelope with the panel arrived, snow falls thick and forgiving, softening even the edge of the sinkhole's mouth. Evan steps onto the porch and hears, carried on a wind that traveled through rock before it touched his face, the tale of a melody he once sang to stay counted. It fades like breath on glass. He smiles without moving and whispers the only thanks that fits the moment. Enough. What remains is simple. We don't own the dark, and we aren't alone in it. Sometimes the wisest thing is to leave a door closed and still set a place at the table. Help when you can quietly. Respect the map's blank parts. Remember that mercy often works best unnoticed.